Because when we last left King David, what we saw was that David, he found himself in this morally compromised position. That David, he told a lie, or at the very least, what he'd done is he had covered up the truth. And as a result, all of the priests of Nob were slaughtered by King Saul. That's what we talked about last week. And this week, we're going to see that David, he's back on the right track. David, he's back to being the king that God's people needed. David, in the passage that we're about to read from 1 Samuel chapter 23, we're going to see that David, in these verses, he is simultaneously hiding out from King Saul, while also heroically defending God's people from the Philistines once again. 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 1 through 14. Verse 1, now they told David, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, look, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? And then David inquired of the Lord again. The Lord answered him, yes, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hands. So David and his men went to Keilah, fought with the Philistines, brought away their livestock, and dealt them a heavy defeat. Thus David rescued the inhabitants of Keilah. And when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, he came down with an ephod in his hand. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he's shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. So Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. And when David learned that Saul was plotting evil against him, he said to the priest Abiathar, bring the ephod here. David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. And now will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, I beseech you, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Verse 12, then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. And then David and his men, who were about 600, they set out and they left Keilah. They wandered wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. And David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but the Lord did not give him into his hand. The Lord did not give him into his hand. In those 14 verses, King David, he seeks God's guidance 4 different times. And in those 14 verses, what David has done is he has sought God more times than King Saul has throughout the entirety of his reign as king over Israel. So from these 14 verses, I believe that what we're going to see is simply that God is our guide. That God is our guide. That just as much as David found that he could follow God's guidance, we too see that we can follow God's guidance as well. But if we're reading these verses closely, then we probably notice that David is guided by God into these places where you and I would never want to be. David's guided by God into a battle that it looks like he's probably going to lose because he's outnumbered. David is guided by God into a city where he's trapped, where there's no escape from King Saul. David is guided by God into a city where they're ready to hand him over to King Saul to betray him. David is guided by God into a situation where his men question his leadership. David's guided into these circumstances that you and I would never want to find ourselves in. But David follows God's guidance nonetheless. David continues to follow God, even though God guides him into some pretty uncomfortable scenarios. So I think that for us to say, okay, God's our guide, we're good to go, let's head out the door, that's not going to cut it. Because we can boil these 14 verses down into 4 short words. God is our guide. But if we don't explain a little bit more what that means, I think that we'd be doing this text and ourselves a great disservice. So this morning, to explore what God's guidance really means, what we're going to do is we're going to take a second look at these verses, because I think that sometimes God's guidance looks different than we might originally have thought. God's guidance doesn't always line up with what we think God's guidance should look like. Sometimes, in fact, I think that I'd go as far as saying that we have some misconceptions about what it means to allow God to guide us. We might have some misconceptions about what it means that God is our guide. And to address those misconceptions, we're going to look at the decisions that David makes here in these verses. And we'll begin here in verses 1 through 2, the 4 different sections in which David seeks God's guidance, the first being verses 1 and 2. Verses 1 and 2, what we're going to see from these verses is that comfort does not equal God's guidance, because David, he is taken into an uncomfortable situation, a situation where he's outnumbered, a situation where it looks like he's facing a battle that he's going to lose. They told David the Philistines are fighting against Keilah. They're robbing the threshing floors. So David inquired of the Lord, and he said, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" The Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah." Comfort does not equal God's guidance. When David seeks God's guidance, where does God lead him? Leads him into a place that's uncomfortable. He leads him into a battle that he's not looking like he's going to win. He leads him into a place that he probably did not want to be in. God's guidance leads David to a place of discomfort. And I think that what we can say is that sometimes what God's going to do is he's going to lead us in a similar fashion. That God's going to guide us, and he might lead us into places where we're a little bit uncomfortable, where we might even have to put our trust in him, where we can't rely on our own strength or our own ability, but where we simply must trust in our God and in his guidance. And I would point out very quickly that King Saul in these verses, what he's done is he's left God's people defenseless. Because if we're reading closely, then we would remember that David, the last time he fought the Philistines, he had dealt them yet again another heavy defeat. So how are the Philistines now back in Israelite territory? How are they back encroaching on the borders of God's people? Well, it's because King Saul, he's gotten so focused on this personal vendetta against David that he's forgotten to defend God's people. King Saul's too busy worrying about slaying the Savior of Israel than he is about saving God's people. King Saul can't get his priorities straight. King Saul, he's the king that the people wanted to fight their battles for them. We've said that time and time again in this series, but it is the one thing that Saul fails to do time and time again. But why does David succeed here? David succeeds here only because he's following God's guidance, because God leads him into this battle, and because God leads him into a place that's not exactly comfortable, a place that's not exactly safe, a place where David must trust in his God. So when we look at this idea that comfort does not equal God's guidance, I wouldn't go as far as saying that discomfort then always equals God's guidance, because I don't think that's how the Bible works. I don't think that we have a rule or a formula for life. But what I would go as far as saying is that when I'm doing something that is a little bit uncomfortable, or when I'm doing something that is maybe even a little bit unsafe, maybe even a little bit dangerous, those are the moments when I feel that I'm most alive. Perfect example of this happened just a couple weeks ago. I had the opportunity to help run some cables here at the church with my good buddy Cage Carter, and we were running some cables from the sound booth to our streaming studio. So if you guys do me a favor and take a look back at the sound booth. So there's the sound booth in the back. Woo, give it up for our sound guys. And then there's the streaming studio, which is in that closet. It's not really a studio. It's more of an exaggerated term. It really is a streaming closet. That's all we've got going right now. So from the sound booth to the streaming closet, we needed to get some wires. And as you can see, there's nothing in between the two other than some ceiling above. So Cage and I were crawling around up in the ceiling, and man, we were trying like every trick known to man, trying to get these cables around. We've got like a cable snake, and we're like pushing these wires along the beams, and that failed. And we tried to get creative. We tried to like ball the cables up and then like chuck them across the ceiling. That obviously failed as well. And then finally we were on the verge of giving up, and I remembered then at that moment, I remembered my philosophy when it comes to working with wiring, which is that I would always rather get that kind of work done quickly rather than safely. So what did I do? I proceeded to take this wire that we were trying to run, and I put it in my mouth, and I clenched my teeth, and I scrambled up onto an I-beam in the ceiling, and I crawled across this I-beam in the ceiling from the sound booth to the streaming studio, dropped down, and got the cable run. And at the end of that, I mean, Cage and I were like high-fiving, we're jumping around, we're jazzed, we're excited because we got the job done, even though it was a little bit dangerous. And what I didn't tell you was that as I'm shimmying across that I-beam, the only thing that was beneath me, or between me rather, and the concrete floors of our lobby 20 feet below was a 1-inch panel of styrofoam drop ceiling. So you could probably say that was a little bit dangerous. I can definitely say that was a little bit uncomfortable. And as I'm telling this story, like, my parents are going to be here, and I can see my mom, she's already thinking, like, I did not raise a son to do dangerous things. And Pastor Ryan, he was here during first service. I could see it on his face, and he was thinking, man, I don't know if workers' comp covers that kind of an injury. And all I'm thinking is, man, I have never felt more alive because I'm doing something that is a little bit dangerous. And we got that cable run. We came down, and I was like, man, that was cool. Like, we got it done, even though it was a little bit dangerous. And I think that following God works in much the same way. When we're following God's guidance, there's going to be times that we're uncomfortable. When we're following God's guidance, there's going to be times maybe where we don't feel like we have it all together. Times where we might even feel like we're a little bit unsafe or a little bit unsteady. But from stories just like these, we can trust that God's guidance always leads us into God's goodness. From stories just like David's, we can trust that God's guidance always leads us into God's goodness. For example, we're going to find that God, He's going to lead us into uncomfortable places. When God asks us to talk to our coworker about why we put our faith in Jesus, it's probably going to be an uncomfortable conversation. It's going to be a difficult conversation for us to have. That's something that God would guide us to do. When we have to say no to certain weekend activities so we can say yes to a Sunday morning service, that's going to be a little bit uncomfortable. That might even cost us some close relationships. But those are the kinds of things that God guides us to do. When God asks us to give more than we're comfortable with, that's God's guidance. That's God leading us. That's God guiding our lives. And that is where God's guidance leads. So we cannot afford to forget that comfort does not equal God's guidance. Comfort does not equal God's guidance. Now in these next few verses, it'd be nice to think that David, he's heard from God. He has his guidance. He brings his decision before his men, and they follow him as the popular leader. But that's not exactly what happens. But David's men, they said to him, look, we're afraid here in Judah. Then how much more are we going to be afraid if we go to Keilah against the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, yes, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah, fought with the Philistines, brought away their livestock, and dealt them a heavy defeat. Thus David rescued the inhabitants of Keilah. David rescued the inhabitants of Keilah, even though his decision to go down into this battle wasn't exactly the most popular one. From these verses, I believe what we see is that popularity does not equal God's guidance. The popular thing is not always going to be the thing that God guides us to do. If we're always and forever going with the flow and going not against the grain, but with the grain, or flowing with culture and what they would have us to do, then we might not be following God's guidance. Because sometimes I might even go as far as saying that God would ask us to do some things that are counter-cultural, or some things that maybe go against what is popular, just like David here in these verses, running into a battle to save a city that's going to betray him, running into a battle to save a city where he is vastly outnumbered. David, he brings before his men this unpopular decision, and really, I think what we have in these verses is an example of David's leadership being on the line. David's leadership being called into question. And the way that David responds when his leadership is called into question, I think it's pretty profound. Because what does David do? When his leadership is called into question, David goes to God, he gets his answer, and then he goes forward. When David's leadership is called into question, he goes to God, he gets his answer, and then he goes forward. David shows us what we should do too when our leadership is called into question. And I know it's easy for us to be hard on David's man. Like, how could you doubt the guidance of God? How could you doubt the future king? But I think that we all do the very same thing. That we all do the very same thing where we question God's guidance. We doubt God's guidance. Or maybe more accurately, what we do is we go to anything and everything else other than the one place where God's guidance is guaranteed to be found. I think we all do this. I know that personally I've been guilty of this before in my life. And it might surprise you to find out that when I was in high school, I was a little bit athletic, at least like a little relatively athletic. That's how I would describe it. And when I was in high school, I remember this moment where I was getting my guidance from all of the wrong places. And this moment's burned into my brain because in this moment, what happened was I lost a wrestling match. Because I was listening to all the wrong voices. Because I wasn't listening to my coach. I was instead listening to my own guidance. And here's what happened. So in this match, it was a very close match. My opponent had scored 2 points with a takedown, and I had scored 1 point with an escape. It's kind of how wrestling works. And I thought for some reason in my dumb high school brain that the scoreboard was flipped. That I was in the lead and that my opponent was behind. So in my brain, I thought, man, all I got to do is wrestle defensively. I'm going to run around this little circle. This dude's not even going to touch me. I am good to go. I have got the deal sealed. Victory is mine. And for some reason, though, my coach, he kept coming up out of his chair and he was screaming, Ryan, you've got to get a takedown. And I was like, man, what is he talking about? Like, why would I put myself at risk? Like going for another take. Like, I've got the lead, man. Like, can't you see the scoreboard? And he wouldn't stop. And then finally we made it to the last period. There's about 15, 20 seconds left. And then my whole team comes up off the bench. They're like, Ryan, you've got to shoot for a takedown. And I'm like, guys, this is silly. Like, I know what I'm supposed to be doing here. I've got the guidance that I need. And we finish the match and we back up to the middle of the mat. We put our little feet on the line. And I'm like preemptively ready to swing my hand up in the air in victory. And then for some reason, the ref holds up my opponent's hand. And it was in that moment that I realized that I was getting my guidance from the wrong places. In that moment, I realized that I was listening to all the wrong voices. I realized that I should have been listening to my coach who had a proper perspective on how this match was going. I should have been listening to my teammates who were outside of the match, able to see what was actually happening, able to see what I had failed to see. I got my guidance from all of the wrong places. That match is burned into my memory. Not because I was wrestling in a nasty singlet with another sweaty guy. That burns some stuff into your memory as well. But that match is burned into my memory because of the way in which I lost. Because I was getting my guidance from all of the wrong places. And I think we do the same thing when it comes to God's guidance. I think we do the very same thing when it comes to God's guidance, because what we'll do is we'll go to anything and everything that's popular before we'll go to God in His guidance. We'll go to a popular podcast before we'll look to what God's Word says about how we should lead our life. We'll go to a YouTuber who tells us how to live before we'll see what God's Word says about how we're to live. We'll look at the latest Instagram influencer before we'll look at what God's Word says about how our lives should be led, about how we can follow God in His guidance. What we cannot afford to forget is that popularity doesn't equal God's guidance. And if we're reading these verses together and understanding that popularity is not the same thing as being guided by God, then I think that we have to ask ourselves if everything that we're doing lines up with everything that people who don't follow Jesus do. If everything that we're doing is supported by culture that doesn't follow Jesus, if everything that we're doing agrees with the world, I think what we have to do is we have to ask ourselves very honestly, how closely are we following God's guidance? Because what we know is that popularity does not equal God's guidance. Now in these next few verses, David, he hears from God once again. He finds God's guidance once again. But in these next few verses also, we have King Saul, who thinks he has found God's guidance. But in fact, what King Saul has done is he's allowed his selfishness to blind him. He's allowed his selfishness to warp and to twist God's guidance to look much more like his own selfish goals than God's guidance in its truest form. Check this out in verses 6 through 11. Verse 6, when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, he came down with an ephod in his hand. And now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah. And Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he's shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. When David learned that Saul was plotting evil against him, he said to the priest Abiathar, bring the ephod here. And David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. And now will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, I beseech you, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. The Lord said, Saul will come down against this city. I believe what we see from Saul's selfishness here in these verses is that selfishness doesn't equal God's guidance either. If we're always getting what we want, we might not be following God's guidance. I don't think that David wanted to be besieged in this city. I do think, though, that Saul wanted to make sure that David was dead. Saul was getting what he wanted. He wasn't following God's guidance. Selfishness does not equal God's guidance. And I know there's a lot going on in these verses, so we're gonna take a look at kind of each of the individuals at play here. Because first of all, we've got this guy by the name of Abiathar. And Abiathar, he was the son of Ahimelech. And you might remember Ahimelech from last weekend, because Ahimelech, he was the priest at Nob who gave David bread and gave David some weapons, helped him out, and as a result, he was slaughtered by King Saul, along with all of the priests and all of their families, the women and the children. That was what Abiathar had witnessed happen to his father. Abiathar watches his father slaughtered by King Saul. He says, I've got to get out of Dodge. I've got to get out of Nob. So what does he do? He runs to David because he knows that David's safe from King Saul. He runs to David because he knows that with David, there is safety. He runs to David, and when he runs to David, he brings with him this thing known as an ephod, which is just a fancy word for a breastplate that the priests would have worn as part of their high priestly garb. Now, the ephod's important, but before we get to the ephod, I just wanted to point this out really quickly, that David, now he's got kind of this like Robin Hood-esque thing going on. Like he's definitely got a Robin Hood vibe, because you've got David fighting the evil king. That's like Robin Hood, right? And then you've got Jonathan, who's really good at fighting. That's like Little John. And then you've got Abiathar. He's like the holy man is Friar Tuck. I mean, we've got the life of David in Disney version. And when Disney comes to me and they want rights for that, and when I get rich, like I will remember New Life Church. Don't worry, I promise. But when Abiathar comes, what he does is he brings the ephod with him. He brings the ephod with him. He brings this breastplate. And the ephod, in the garb of the priests, what it was a breastplate that had 12 little stones in it. And each one of those stones symbolized the 12 tribes of God's people. So the idea was that the priest, he'd put on this ephod, and he would stand in God's presence. He would stand before God, and he would represent the people. He would carry the people symbolically into the presence of God. And then the priest, he'd come over here wearing the ephod. And he's wearing the ephod. He'd come over here and he'd speak to God's people. And he would speak on God's behalf to God's people. And so in some sense, we have the priest who's standing here in the middle between God and the people. And what does the priest do? The priest, he represents the people to their God, and he represents God to his people. And when Abiathar brings the ephod, what we have is this striking symbol that God and his guidance are going with David, but that they are far from King Saul. God's presence is with David. God's priest is with David. The ephod is with David. God is with David, but God is far from King Saul, or maybe more accurately, King Saul is very far from God. But that's not what Saul thinks, is it? What does Saul say here in these verses? Saul says, oh, God has given David into my hand. Saul is so insane and mad at this point that he thinks it has become God's will that he would slay the Savior of Israel. Saul is so far gone at this point that his selfishness has blinded him, and he's twisted God's guidance to look much more like his own selfish goals and his own selfish purposes. And it's easy for us to be like, man, King Saul, that's a bad dude. But then when we look a little bit closer, we realize that we do the exact same thing. We all are just like King Saul here in these verses. And I don't think that any of us are quite as sinister, trying to make sure that our enemies are slaughtered. I don't think that's how we approach selfishness. But I do think we do much the same thing, because we forget that selfishness does not equal God's guidance. We forget that selfishness doesn't equal God's guidance. And I know that I've done this before, and I know that I'll do it again. But most recently, I can think of one example in my life. My in-laws, they are in the process of planning this like big family vacation. Okay, and in this family vacation, it's going to be like my wife and myself and her two brothers and their spouses and all of the kids and my mother-in-law and my father-in-law. And I can see it on some of your faces. For some of you, that's like dream vacay. And then others of you, that's like, man, my worst nightmare. And I'm not going to give away where I land on that spectrum. But what I will say is that you may be surprised to know that I am quite the vacation planner. That I have been immensely involved in the vacation planning process because here's the deal. I know what's going to happen. If I don't help them plan activities, we're going to end up doing stuff that nobody wants to do. We're going to end up doing a lot of sitting at the beach, sitting at the beach. We're going to end up shopping at a lot of places I don't want to shop. And we're going to end up eating at a lot of restaurants in Florida where I got to dress up. And that does not sound like my kind of vacation. Everybody knows that is not the stuff that good vacations are made of. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to come up with family-friendly fun. Fun that includes everybody's interests. For example, tried to find us a catamaran charter. Ooh, catamaran charter. With a deep sea fishing charter tagged on as well. Because that's the kind of fun, that includes everybody's interest, right? See the beautiful sunset, catch some tuna. That sounds like an awesome vacation. But what I've done in that moment is exactly what King Saul does here in these verses. I've taken my own selfish desires, and I've tried to shroud them and cloak them and morph them into seeming like they serve everybody else's desires. I try to make my selfishness seem like what is good for everybody else. It's exactly what Saul does in these verses. We often get confused with what God wants and what we want. We get the two mixed up very often because we forget that selfishness does not equal God's guidance. And I'm still trying to figure this one out. So my nephew, he's about 2 years old. And like I said, I'm looking for like family-friendly fun, right? So I'm trying to figure out, and you guys can help me out with this if you got any ideas. Let me know in the lobby after service. I'm trying to figure out how we can make it happen where the family goes Florida hog hunting. Because that sounds like a great time to me. That sounds like family-friendly fun to me. But like I said, that is exactly what King Saul does here, forgetting that selfishness does not equal God's guidance. Now, I know that that's something that probably not just myself, but probably all of us in the room have dealt with from time to time. But the good news is that God, He's given us the antidote for that selfishness. It's His guidance that comes from His Word. It's His guidance that comes from His Spirit. It's His guidance that is made readily available to us, no longer through an ephod and a high priest and His presence reserved for the temple. No, instead, what God has done is He's given us His Spirit within Him. He's given us His Word with us. He's given us a church full of pastors and staff and connect group leaders and volunteers who are guiding us to know Jesus better. God's guidance is quite literally at our fingertips, but it's up to us to put that guidance to good use. We can't afford to forget that selfishness does not equal God's guidance. Selfishness does not equal God's guidance. Now, in the final few verses here, verses 12 through 14, David, he seeks God's guidance one more time. And in these verses, David hears from God something that I doubt he was looking forward to hearing. He hears that the men and the women in the city of Keilah will readily hand him over to King Saul. They're ready to betray him and turn their back on him, even though he has just saved them. Verses 12 through 14. Then David said, "Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul?" And the Lord said, "They will surrender you." Then David and his men, who were about 600, they set out. They left Keilah, and they wandered wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. And David, he remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but the Lord did not give him into his hand. And I believe what we see from these final few verses is that solidarity does not equal God's guidance. That David, in these last few verses, he stands all alone. He stands abandoned by the city that he's just saved, betrayed by the city that he's just saved, ready for them to hand him over to King Saul. No one to stand in solidarity with him, no one to back him up, nobody to be behind him. David stands alone. And sometimes when we follow God's guidance, it's going to take us to places where we look behind us and there's not anybody following. When we follow God's guidance, it's not always going to take us to places where we have a crowd. It's going to take us to places where we're not always the most popular, where there's not a bunch of people who want to be with us. Sometimes when we follow God's guidance, it's going to feel very lonely. And I would just point this out as well, that King Saul, in these verses, he takes things to another level even here. Because he's not going to war against the Philistines. He's not going to war against even David. He's summoning all of his forces to go to war against his own people. He's attacking the city of Keilah. He's coming to besiege and to destroy this city, and I know how easy it is for us to be critical of the citizens of Keilah. To say, well, how could they betray the one who just saved them? How could they betray the one who just saved them? But think about what they would think about. They would know that Saul just slaughtered all the priests of Nob. They have good reason to turn David over because they know that Saul is coming to destroy their city. And as much as it's easy for us to point the finger at the people of Keilah, I think when we do, all we're doing really is we're pointing the finger back at ourselves, because we have to remember how readily we've turned our back on the one who has saved our souls. Because when we look at what David is feeling, when we ponder what David is feeling, the betrayal that David experiences here, I believe what happens is we're pointed to an even greater betrayal. We're pointed to an even greater betrayal where Jesus himself is betrayed. Where Jesus himself is left alone. Where Jesus himself has no one to stand in solidarity with him, not even the disciples that he came to save. As Jesus stands alone on the cross, we see that Jesus, following God's guidance all the way up to that point, now has no one with him. No one to stand in solidarity. No one to stand behind him. And I think that we have to consider the betrayal that's happened at our own hands. That we too have been willing to turn our back on the one that has saved us. How we too have been willing to save ourselves, to save our image, or to save our importance if it means not following God's guidance. And I know that we can find ourselves here in these verses, but I believe that we can also find Jesus here in these verses. We find Jesus here in these verses because what do we find? We find that Jesus, he follows God's guidance all the way to the cross. He follows God's guidance all the way to the cross, to the point of immense discomfort. He follows God's guidance to the point of least popularity, even to the point of greatest shame, to the cross. Jesus, he follows God's guidance. Where selfishness has been left behind and only self-sacrifice remains, Jesus, he follows God's guidance where no one is standing with him in solidarity, not even the ones he has come to save. Jesus, he follows God's guidance all the way to the cross. And as we look upon the cross, what we see is that Jesus, he stands just as David stood with the ephod. Standing between man and standing between God. Bridging the gap, representing God before man and representing man before God. And as we look to Jesus this morning, what do we see? We see the solution to our need for God's guidance. As we look to Jesus this morning, we see that he needed God's guidance. And if Jesus needed God's guidance, then how much more do we? Jesus, we thank you this morning for how you've shown us what God's guidance looks like. How you've addressed the misconceptions that we might have about what it means to be guided by God. God, help us to know that sometimes when we follow you that we're going to be uncomfortable. But God, that we have to trust that we're following you. God, help us to know that sometimes when we follow your guidance, when you're leading us, that it's not always going to take us to the places of popularity, but that it will take us into your goodness. God, help us to know that when we're following you, it's going to mean that there's some self-sacrifice involved. But God, help us to know that's what's best for us. God, we know that following you means that we're going to sometimes feel like we're alone. There's no one with us and no one to stand beside us. But God, help us to know that you're always beside us, that you're always with us, that you stand in solidarity with us. God, help us to know that just as much as you could guide David, just as much as you could guide Jesus, you can be our guide this morning. And God, challenge and encourage our hearts to seek your guidance first. Jesus, we're praying all these things in your mighty name. And everyone said, amen.
Thank you for watching us on YouTube today. We hope that the content that you heard helped you know Jesus better.
Also, don't forget to click subscribe and to click the bell icon so that you'll get notified every time our channel drops a new video.
If you would like to partner with us and what God is doing here at New Life, there are 3 ways that you can give.
You can give by mailing a check to the church, you can give by going to giving.nlspringfield.com, or you can text 84321 with the amount that you'd like to give.
And if you would like to connect with us in any other way, you can visit us at nlspringfield.com, click on the Connect tab, and we will get back to you as soon as we can.
See you next week.